Chapter 1. The Sicilian Beginnings. The sun-drenched streets of Palermo, Sicily, were a far cry from the bustling metropolis of New York City that would one day bear witness to the rise and fall of the notorious mobster, Joe Masseria. Born in the late 1800s to a modest family, Masseria's early life was shaped by the tumultuous social and political landscape of his homeland, where the influence of the Sicilian Mafia loomed large. As a young boy, Masseria witnessed firsthand the power struggles and violent clashes that defined the criminal underworld of his time. The streets were a battleground where rival factions vied for control, and the weak were quickly swallowed by the strong. It was in this environment that Masseria's own thirst for power and his willingness to resort to ruthless tactics began to take root. The Masseria family, like many others, had long been embroiled in the web of Sicilian Mafia activities, with his father and uncles maintaining tenuous connections to the criminal networks that dominated the region. Masseria's early exposure to this world instilled in him a deep-seated respect for the power and influence wielded by the Mafia, and he soon became determined to carve out his own place within this treacherous landscape. As he grew older, Masseria's involvement in the Mafia's operations deepened, and he quickly established a reputation for his cunning and his propensity for violence. He was not content to remain a mere foot soldier, however. Masseria's ambition knew no bounds, and he set his sights on ascending the ranks of the criminal hierarchy. Leveraging his family's connections and his own ruthless instincts, Masseria began to assert his dominance within the local Mafia families. He forged alliances, brokered deals, and eliminated rivals with a cold and calculating precision that belied his young age. His rise through the ranks was meteoric, and it was not long before Masseria's name became synonymous with the unbridled power and influence of the Sicilian Mafia. Yet even as Masseria's reputation grew, the political and social turmoil that plagued Sicily during this period presented a growing threat to his ambitions. The island was in a state of upheaval, with the Italian government's efforts to exert control over the region leading to increasingly violent clashes between the Mafia and the authorities. Sensing the potential for greater opportunities across the ocean, Masseria made the fateful decision to leave the familiar streets of Palermo behind and seek his fortune in the United States. The promise of a new frontier, where the Mafia's influence was still taking root, proved too tempting to ignore. And in the early years of the 20th century, Masseria set sail for the bustling city of New York. As the ship carrying the young Sicilian approached the towering skyline of Manhattan, Masseria's eyes gleamed with a fierce determination. He had left behind the violence and chaos of his homeland, but he carried with him an unwavering ambition and a ruthless disregard for the rules that governed the world above. In the burgeoning criminal landscape of New York City, Masseria saw the potential to forge a legacy that would eclipse even the most powerful Mafia bosses of his time. The journey that would ultimately transform Joe Masseria into the boss of bosses had only just begun. In the months that followed his arrival in New York, Masseria wasted no time in establishing himself within the Italian-American criminal networks that were rapidly taking shape in the city. Drawing on the connections and expertise he had honed in Sicily, he quickly forged alliances with other ambitious young men who shared his thirst for power and influence. Masseria's early years in New York were marked by a relentless pursuit of power and control as he maneuvered his way through the complex web of Mafia families and sought to carve out his own territory. He was a master of strategy, adept at exploiting the rivalries and tensions that existed between the various factions, and he was not afraid to resort to violence to eliminate those who stood in his way. As Masseria's influence grew, so too did his reputation as a ruthless and calculating individual, willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. He cultivated a fearsome image, striking fear into the hearts of his rivals and subordinates alike, and he quickly established himself as a force to be reckoned with in the burgeoning world of American organized crime. Yet, even as Masseria's power and prestige continued to rise, he remained a figure shrouded in mystery, his true motivations and ambitions known only to a select few. Those who dared to cross him, however, learned the hard way that Masseria's thirst for control was unquenchable and that he would stop at nothing to maintain his position at the top of the criminal hierarchy. As the years passed, Masseria's reputation as a skilled strategist and a merciless enforcer only grew, and he began to draw the attention of law enforcement and rival mafia figures alike. The stage was set for a power struggle that would define the course of Masseria's life and the very fabric of the American underworld. In the years to come, Masseria's rise to power would be marked by a relentless pursuit of dominance, a willingness to engage in ruthless acts of violence, and a calculated disregard for the rules and norms that governed the world around him. But as he would soon discover, the path to the top was fraught with challenges and dangers, and the price of his ambition would be steep. Chapter 2: The Rise of the Boss of Bosses. The bustling streets of New York City in the early 20th century were a far cry from the sun-drenched alleys of Palermo. But Joe Masseria quickly found that the city's burgeoning criminal underworld offered ample opportunities for a man of his ambition and cunning. With a steely gaze and a ruthless determination, he set out to carve his own path to the top of the mafia hierarchy. Leveraging the connections and expertise he had honed in Sicily, Masseria wasted little time in establishing himself within the Italian-American criminal networks that were rapidly taking shape in the city. He forged alliances with other young, ambitious men, many of whom had also recently arrived from the old world, and together they began to assert their dominance over the various mafia families vying for control. Masseria's rise was marked by a strategic brilliance and a complete disregard for the rules and norms that governed the world above. He recognized that the key to power in the mafia lay not in brute force alone, but in the ability to manipulate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the criminal landscape. With a keen eye for opportunity and an unwavering commitment to his own agenda, Masseria began to maneuver his way through the ranks, forging new partnerships and systematically eliminating those who stood in his way. As his influence grew, Masseria's reputation as a ruthless and cunning operator began to spread, striking fear into the hearts of his rivals and subordinates alike. He was not content to simply seize control of a single mafia family. Instead, his ambitions knew no bounds, and he set his sights on consolidating power across the entire Italian-American criminal underworld. One by one, Masseria methodically eliminated the competition, using a combination of bribery, intimidation, and outright violence to assert his dominance. He was a master strategist, adept at exploiting the weaknesses and divisions within the mafia families, and he was not afraid to play one faction against another to achieve his goals. Masseria's rise to power was not without its challenges, however. The shifting alliances and power dynamics within the mafia world were constantly in flux, and he was forced to navigate a treacherous landscape of shifting loyalties and betrayals. But Masseria's unwavering determination and his willingness to do whatever it took to succeed ensured that he always remained one step ahead of his rivals. As his influence and control continued to grow, Masseria began to cultivate a reputation as the boss of bosses, a title that he would eventually earn through a combination of cunning, brutality, and an unparalleled ability to manipulate the criminal underworld to his advantage. One of the key figures in Masseria's rise to power was the legendary Lucky Luciano, a young upstart who had quickly made a name for himself in the mafia world. Luciano, like Masseria, had a keen understanding of the complex power dynamics that defined the criminal landscape, and the two men forged an uneasy alliance that would shape the course of their careers. Together, Masseria and Luciano began to consolidate their power, eliminating rivals and establishing a network of loyal followers who were willing to do their bidding. Masseria's ruthless tactics and Luciano's strategic acumen proved to be a formidable combination, and they soon found themselves at the center of a growing criminal empire that stretched across the city. But as Masseria's power grew, so too did the resentment and jealousy of his rivals. The other mafia families, sensing the threat that Masseria posed to their own ambitions, began to plot against him, seeking to undermine his influence and challenge his supremacy. It was during this tumultuous period that Masseria's relationship with Luciano began to fray. The two men, once allies, now found themselves locked in a complex web of shifting alliances and competing interests, each vying for a greater share of the spoils. The tension between them was palpable, and it was clear that a showdown was inevitable. Masseria, ever the strategist, recognized the danger that Luciano and his allies posed to his reign as the boss of bosses. He moved quickly to consolidate his power, tightening his grip on the criminal networks that he had worked so hard to build. He ruthlessly eliminated those who dared to challenge his authority, sending a clear message to his rivals that he would stop at nothing to maintain his position at the top. But Luciano and his cohorts were not to be underestimated. They too had grown powerful and influential, and they were not willing to simply submit to Masseria's dominance. As the tensions between the two factions escalated, the city found itself caught in the crosshairs of a brutal power struggle that would come to define the golden age of American organized crime. The streets of New York were soon awash in blood as the two sides engaged in a series of violent confrontations, each side determined to emerge victorious. Masseria, ever the ruthless tactician, employed a range of tactics to maintain his grip on power, from strategic assassinations to the manipulation of law enforcement and political figures. Yet, even as Masseria's power and influence continued to grow, the cracks in his empire began to show. The constant threat of retaliation from his rivals, the ever-shifting alliances, and the growing pressure from law enforcement all began to take a toll on the boss of bosses. He found himself increasingly isolated, his once formidable network of allies and subordinates now questioning his ability to lead. It was during this tumultuous period that Masseria's relationship with Luciano reached a breaking point. The two men, once uneasy allies, now found themselves on opposite sides of the power struggle, each determined to emerge victorious. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine the future of the American Mafia. As the city braced for the inevitable showdown, Masseria knew that his reign as the boss of bosses was hanging in the balance. He had fought tooth and nail to claw his way to the top, and he was not about to relinquish his hard-won power without a fight. But the forces arrayed against him were formidable, and Masseria found himself facing the greatest challenge of his career. In the days and weeks that followed, the city would bear witness to a brutal and bloody struggle for supremacy as Masseria and his rivals fought for control of the criminal underworld. The outcome of this clash would not only determine the fate of the boss of bosses, but would also shape the course of the American Mafia for years to come. Chapter 3. The Reign of Terror. The streets of New York City were awash in blood and fear as Joe Masseria's grip on power tightened with an iron fist. Having solidified his position as the undisputed boss of bosses, he unleashed a campaign of terror upon his rivals and those who dared to challenge his supremacy. Masseria's ruthless tactics were the stuff of legend, and his name struck terror into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. He had built his empire through a relentless pursuit of power, a willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in his way, and an unwavering determination to maintain his dominance over the American Mafia. With Lucky Luciano and his allies now firmly in his sights, Masseria set out to crush the upstart faction once and for all. He deployed his most trusted lieutenants, men who had proven their loyalty through acts of violence and betrayal, to gather intelligence and lay the groundwork for a decisive strike. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in mafia strategy and brutality. Masseria's operatives infiltrated Luciano's inner circle, sowing seeds of discord and suspicion. Trusted lieutenants were eliminated, safe houses were raided, and the flow of information was choked off, leaving Luciano and his allies disoriented and vulnerable. As the pressure mounted, Masseria struck with ruthless efficiency. Targeted assassinations, car bombings, and brutal beatings became the hallmarks of his reign of terror, sending a clear message to his rivals that defiance would not be tolerated. The streets of New York were transformed into a battleground, with the bodies of Masseria's victims serving as grim reminders of his power. But Masseria's ambitions extended far beyond the confines of the criminal underworld. He had long recognized the importance of forging alliances with corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials, and he leveraged these connections to shield himself from the prying eyes of the authorities. Through a carefully orchestrated system of bribery and intimidation, Masseria ensured that his operations were protected from interference. He cultivated a network of informants within the police force and the city government, providing him with advance warning of any impending crackdowns or investigations. When the law did come calling, Masseria's influence and deep pockets often proved too powerful to overcome. As Masseria's stranglehold on the mafia tightened, the ripple effects of his reign of terror began to be felt throughout the broader community. Businesses were forced to pay hefty protection fees or face the consequences, and ordinary citizens lived in fear of the violence that could erupt at any moment. The impact of Masseria's actions was not limited to the criminal underworld, however. His influence extended into the political sphere, where he leveraged his vast resources and network of connections to exert control over elected officials and shape the course of events to suit his own agenda. Masseria's ruthless tactics and uncompromising ambition made him a formidable force to be reckoned with, and those who dared to challenge his authority often found themselves on the receiving end of his wrath. The city's power brokers, from business leaders to political figures, knew that crossing Masseria could have devastating consequences, and many chose to appease him rather than risk the consequences. As Masseria's reign of terror reached its zenith, the city found itself in the grip of a pervasive sense of fear and uncertainty. Whispers of Masseria's exploits spread like wildfire, fueling a climate of suspicion and mistrust that permeated every corner of the metropolis. Yet, even as Masseria's power and influence continued to grow, the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. The constant need to eliminate rivals, maintain alliances, and fend off the attentions of law enforcement had taken a toll on the boss of bosses, leaving him increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Masseria's closest confidants, men who had once been his most loyal followers, began to question his judgment and his ability to lead. The strain of maintaining such a vast criminal empire was beginning to show, and cracks in Masseria's armor began to emerge. At the same time, the younger generation of mafia upstarts, led by the likes of Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, were growing increasingly restless. They recognized the vulnerabilities in Masseria's reign and began to plot their own ascent to power, determined to topple the boss of bosses and carve out their own piece of the criminal pie. As the tensions within the mafia world reached a fever pitch, the city braced itself for a final showdown. Masseria, sensing the growing threat to his position, tightened his grip on power, unleashing a new wave of violence and brutality in a desperate bid to maintain his supremacy. The streets of New York became a battleground, with rival factions engaging in a bloody struggle for control. Masseria's trusted lieutenants were picked off one by one, their bodies serving as grim reminders of the high stakes involved in the power struggle. Yet even as Masseria's grip on power began to slip, he refused to relinquish his position without a fight. He deployed his most ruthless tactics, employing bribery, intimidation, and outright violence to maintain his hold on the criminal underworld. But the tide was turning, and Masseria's adversaries were closing in. Luciano and his allies, sensing the vulnerability in Masseria's position, launched a coordinated attack, striking at the heart of the boss of bosses empire. The final confrontation was a brutal and bloody affair, with both sides engaged in a no-holds-barred struggle for supremacy. Masseria, his once formidable power beginning to wane, fought with a desperate ferocity, but the combined forces of Luciano and his allies proved to be too much to overcome. In the end, Masseria's reign of terror came to a sudden and violent end, as he was gunned down in a hail of bullets during a fateful meeting with his rivals. The boss of bosses had finally met his match, and the American Mafia was left to grapple with the aftermath of his downfall. As the city began to recover from the carnage, the legacy of Joe Masseria's reign of terror remained etched into the collective consciousness of the people. His name had become synonymous with the ruthless brutality and unchecked ambition that had defined the golden age of American organized crime, and his fall from power served as a stark reminder of the fragility of even the most entrenched criminal empires. In the wake of Masseria's demise, a new era dawned, one marked by a shifting balance of power and the emergence of a new generation of mafia leaders. The city would never be the same, having borne witness to the rise and fall of one of the most formidable figures in the annals of American organized crime. Chapter 4: The Downfall of the Boss. The city of New York stood in the uneasy calm that followed the violent storm that had consumed the criminal underworld. The dust had barely settled on the brutal confrontation that had claimed the life of Joe Masseria, the once powerful boss of bosses, when a new power dynamic began to take shape. Masseria's downfall had been a long time coming, the result of a carefully orchestrated plot by his rivals, led by the ambitious and calculating Lucky Luciano. For years, Luciano had been biding his time, watching as Masseria's iron grip on the mafia tightened, his reign of terror striking fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. But Luciano was not one to be intimidated. He recognized the vulnerabilities in Masseria's empire, the cracks that had begun to show as the strain of maintaining such a vast criminal enterprise took its toll. With his keen intellect and strategic prowess, Luciano set in motion a plan to bring down the boss of bosses and seize control of the American Mafia for himself. The final confrontation had been a brutal and bloody affair, with Masseria's trusted lieutenants falling one by one to the relentless onslaught of Luciano's forces. The streets of New York had become a battlefield, the city's residents forced to cower in their homes as the sound of gunfire and the screams of the dying echoed through the night. In the end, Masseria's reign of terror had come to a sudden and violent end, as he was gunned down in a hail of bullets during a fateful meeting with his rivals. The boss of bosses had finally met his match, his once formidable power and influence crumbling in the face of Luciano's ruthless ambition. The aftermath of Masseria's downfall was a complex and multifaceted affair, with the various mafia factions jockeying for position in the power vacuum that had been created. Luciano, of course, emerged as the clear victor, his control over the criminal underworld solidified by the elimination of his longtime rival. But Luciano was not content to simply bask in his triumph. He recognized that the American Mafia was in a state of flux, with old alliances crumbling and new power structures beginning to take shape. If he was to maintain his position at the top, he would need to act quickly and decisively to consolidate his power and cement his authority. To that end, Luciano set about systematically eliminating any potential threats to his supremacy. He ruthlessly cut down those who had once been loyal to Masseria, sending a clear message to the rest of the mafia that defiance would not be tolerated. At the same time, he forged new alliances, carefully cultivating relationships with key figures within the criminal underworld and the political establishment. As Luciano's grip on power tightened, the city found itself in the throes of a new era of mafia dominance. The violence and brutality that had defined Masseria's reign gave way to a more calculated and strategic approach, with Luciano leveraging his vast resources and network of connections to maintain his control. Yet, even as Luciano solidified his position as the new boss of bosses, the echoes of Masseria's legacy continued to reverberate through the criminal underworld. The sheer scale of Masseria's ambition and the ruthlessness with which he had pursued his goals had left an indelible mark on the mafia, and his name had become synonymous with the raw, unbridled power that had once defined the American organized crime landscape. In the years that followed, Luciano and his allies would work tirelessly to distance themselves from Masseria's legacy, seeking to cultivate a more refined and sophisticated image for the mafia. They recognized that the days of unrestrained violence and brutality were coming to an end, and that a new era of strategic alliances and calculated maneuvering was dawning. But the specter of Masseria's reign would never truly be erased. His name would continue to be invoked by those who sought to understand the roots of the mafia's power, and his story would serve as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the relentless pursuit of control. As the city began to recover from the upheaval that had gripped it, the legacy of Joe Masseria's downfall loomed large, a stark reminder of the fragility of even the most entrenched criminal empires. The boss of bosses had fallen, his reign of terror brought to a sudden and violent end, and in his wake, a new order had emerged, one that would shape the future of the American Mafia for years to come. For Luciano and his allies, the task of rebuilding and redefining the Mafia's image was a daunting one, fraught with challenges and dangers. They knew that they would need to tread carefully, navigating the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the criminal underworld, all while ensuring that their own grip on power remained unshakable. But Luciano was not one to be deterred by such obstacles. He had proven his mettle in the brutal power struggle that had brought down Masseria, and he was confident in his ability to lead the Mafia into a new era of prosperity and influence. As the city began to heal from the wounds inflicted by Masseria's reign of terror, the eyes of the criminal underworld turned to Luciano, watching with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation to see how he would shape the future of the American Mafia. The stakes were high, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. But Luciano was determined to emerge victorious, cementing his legacy as the new boss of bosses and forever casting the shadow of Joe Masseria's downfall into the annals of history. In the end, the story of Joe Masseria's rise and fall would serve as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the ruthless pursuit of power. But it would also be a testament to the resilience of the criminal underworld, a world that was ever-changing, ever-evolving, and ever-adapting to the shifting tides of power and influence. As the city moved forward, the memory of Masseria's reign of terror would linger, a haunting reminder of the price that was paid for the pursuit of absolute control. And in the shadow of his downfall, a new generation of mafia leaders would emerge, each seeking to carve out their own piece of the criminal empire, each determined to leave their own indelible mark on the annals of American organized crime.